G'day, Stu from UAVfutures here, and today, well, I'm going to be talking about how to choose the correct mini quad frame for you. So how to find one that's going to be best for you and what you want to do with it. So I've seen quite a few frames in my day, and we're going to be going through, and I get asked this question actually all the time. People say, Stuart, alright, I love what you're doing, this FPV stuff looks really cool, what frame should I get? And it's really a personal decision because there's a lot of things to take into account. So today we're going to be talking about like the size of the frame, the prop size that it can run. You need to think about things like where are you going to be flying, what sort of stuff do you want to do with it, maybe how good of a builder you are, do you need a lot of space, how are you with soldering, a whole bunch of things. We're going to have a look at them, and hopefully by the end you'll be much more informed and you can choose the right frame that is right for you. Anyway, enough of me rambling at the camera here. Let's chuck some frames on the bench and get started. Alrighty, so let's break it down, and the first thing we're going to look at is size. Now there's a whole bunch of confusing names out here, so you've got things like the 280, what do we got? We got a 250, a 180, a 155, a 120, or a 118. They got a whole bunch of confusing names or numbers, and that pretty much just refers to the distance between motor to motor. And to be honest, I find that a pretty useless stat. What we really need to know, and how I think frames should be classed, in my opinion anyway, is based on the size of the prop that they can swing. So this is actually a 280 size quad. This is my Emax Nighthawk, and this is the first one I ever got actually, and this can spin a 6-inch prop. So I have a 6-inch prop here. So this is how I'm going to class sort of my crafts and things like that, based on the maximum size prop that they can run. So this can easily spin a 6-inch prop. Moving down right here, this is a 250, no, this is a 210, but I would just say that this is a 5-inch prop. So if you look here, this can spin a 5-inch, but if I put on my 6-inch, it's going to clip into the sides just there. So when people are talking about what size craft they have, really I think in the racing scene, what they're sort of referring to is the maximum size prop that they can spin on their motors without it clipping into the frame, so it can spin freely. And moving down into the smaller sort of size, we've got these two, and these can spin 4-inch props comfortably. And you notice they look completely different. They're completely different sizes, but so that's why I find it not useful to call it, say this is a 180 or a 185, and this is actually a 155. But both of these, they can spin 4-inch props, so these two can spin 4-inch props. And then right down the other end, you've got some tiny little things, like I've got this tiny little Atom here, which can spin a tiny little 3-inch prop. Or I've got this Owl, which is also spinning 3-inch props just here. So when people talk about the size of the frame, don't worry about the numbers too much. What you really need to think of and find out is what is the size of the prop that you're going to be running. So whether it be 3, 4, 5, or 6-inch. Now when you're choosing a frame, it is not just the size of the prop that you're spinning that you need to worry about, but depending on what sort of builder you are, you also need to think about how much real estate you have inside the quad. So this is in this Emax Nighthawk right here. If you look, I have a ton of space to put in all my components and things like that. So I could definitely recommend sort of a larger frame like this to maybe some people who are getting just into the hobby, or they don't have too many soldering experience skills or anything like that. And then on the other hand, I guess once you've built quite a few quads, you can try and cram all your components into something tiny like this little Rotor X Atom right here. And generally speaking, most of the components in here will be very, very similar. So I've got some builds. Besides the motors on the outside, I'd use the same ESCs. I would use a little bit of a larger camera in here, but I'd probably use the same flight controller, the same transmitter, the same VTX, and some people even would use the same receiver, a D4R2 in one of these bad boys as well. So most of the components that you can fit in here, you could almost transport straight directly into here. So depending on your skill levels and how confident you feel in building, you need to make sure that you can pick a frame that you're going to be able to build a good quadcopter in. I guess, and there's no point getting a frame if you're going to put things on the outside or mount them in places where they're not really meant to be, because the frame is sort of what's meant to take the impact and protect our expensive components inside. And one of the final things you need to consider just about size is how well it's going to cut through the air. So this is the underside, you can see, of a Speed Addict 180R compared to something like the Orion 155X, and they're both going to swing 4-inch props. But this one has a much smaller profile than this one, so this thing should, theoretically, with the aerodynamics and stuff, be able to slice through the air a lot better than something like this. And it gets even worse. The bigger you get, say something like this would be pushing a lot of air out of the way compared to something small like one of these little bad boys. And this was definitely the thinking behind some of these craft when it came to, like, I guess they'd say the 210 sort of size frame, and everybody went from 250s down to 210s because most people were running 5-inch props, and they were sort of getting as close as they'd like them to the sort of standoffs and things like that. So it's all about running the biggest prop that you can and getting the smallest frame so it can slice through the air. Plus it'll be a bit lighter and stuff like that as well. Alrighty, let's have a look at some of the different sizes we've got just here. So this is a one that can run 6-inch, and you might be saying, Stu, what is a 6-inch good for? Absolutely not. So if you're going to be flying with 6-inch props, you're probably going to be having a very high amount of thrust, a large top speed, and you're probably wanting to be flying this thing outdoors in some big open spaces. Because it is going to be so wide, you're probably going to want to have some larger gaps if you are going to be hitting some gaps. So I don't know if it'll be the best for proximity flying, but it will have a ton of thrust and will get a huge top speed. So that is definitely what I think, in my opinion, the 6-inch prop is best for, frames that can fly with 6-inch. It's also going to have plenty of power and thrust if you need to carry a GoPro or something like that, if you want to fly around and have an action camera. So definitely a good open field or high speed quad just here. Let's move down to its 5-inch little brother. Alright, so let's have a look at the 5-inch that I've got here. Now this is the Epi 210X, and this thing can swing 5-inch props, and I really think 5-inch is the sweet spot for racers. You're still going to get a ton of speed. You've got enough sort of thrust here to carry a GoPro without suffering too many penalties to your sort of performance. Because its props are a bit smaller than, say, its 6-inch brothers, it can spin them a little bit faster, and it's a bit more snappy than sort of the 6-inch. 6-inch tends to feel a little bit more sort of floaty, but this is going to be a lot more snappy, and it's sort of a good mix between speed and agility. So if you want to take this thing maybe to some outdoor races where you're racing through gates around flags and things like that, this is definitely sort of the frame to go to. Plus this is probably the most popular class of racer out there as well, because people can do so many things with it. It's so versatile, whether you want to do big punch outs or maybe some tight little turns and things like that. Alrighty, so right here I've got its little brother, and this is the 4-inch EpiQuad. So this is the 180X from EpiQuads, and you'll see here it's spinning 4-inch frames, and you might 4-inch props, I should say. And you might be saying, Stuart, okay, so what is all the craze about the 180s, or the ones that can spin a 4-inch prop? And the thing is, I think they're more fun. So these quads just here, they suffer a little bit more when you put a GoPro on them, so they're not the best at carrying a GoPro, but still more than capable. They just suffer a little bit, so they tend to have a little bit lower thrust than its 5-inch brothers, but they are super nimble. You can fly these in much smaller places, hit heaps tinier gaps, because look at the size difference. If you're going to put this on here, think of the gap that you can have. So let's line that up, and then you'd have another 6-inch quad. You can't even see it, it's going off the screen. So maybe it's probably looking at a 4-inch quad versus a 6-inch on the diagonal. You're probably almost looking at twice the size of the gap that you'll need to get through if you're using a 6-inch quad rather than one of these 4-inch. Now, because the props are smaller, you're going to find it's a lot more snappy and responsive, especially in the turns and sort of doing some of those fast flips and rolls and things like that. So it can be great for sort of some little indoor tricks, or sort of some really, really tight racing courses where there might not be the longest straight and high speed things, but there's definitely some nice little turns and twists. This is definitely where the 4-inch quad excels. Oh, and it's worth noting too that just because I've got some tapered 4-inch props on here doesn't mean you couldn't run some 4-inch props like this. Both of these crafts will run, this is the Speed Addict 180R, will run 4-inch just here. So a 4-inch quad is probably what I would recommend for all first-time builders out there. There's still enough room where you can put your components in here if you think carefully and do a little bit of planning. You can carry an action camera if you want to, but I find them to be the most fun quads. So you can fly these things in a lot smaller spaces. They're great if you want to take them to smaller like a race, like a go-kart track and things like that. I think that's where these sort of quads excel. They won't have as much thrust or higher top speed, but they definitely make up for it in the fun factor. Plus, they're a bit more transportable. You can put them in a smaller case and things like that. So I can definitely recommend the 4-inch flyers out there to anyone who's looking to get into the hobby. I think they make great first frame. Alright, moving down, we've got our 3-inch quads just here. Now, what are these good for? Well, I'll tell you what they're not good for, and that is building. So, if you're trying to build one of these bad boys, it can be a bit of a nightmare if you don't know what you're doing. So, I definitely don't recommend people go out and try one of these for their first builds, unless they're feeling very, very confident with their soldering skills and things like that, because they can be a little bit difficult to put together. But in saying that, they are probably some of the most fun you can have, at least for me anyway, because you can take these things anywhere. You can hit tiny little gaps, fly them under chairs, sort of, you can fly these things in so many places where the bigger, faster quads would just crash and burn. There'd be no way, unless you had insane piloting skills, that you'd be able to get through there. And I think that's really where these things shine. They are all about having fun. So take them anywhere, just fly the heck out of them and have a great time. So things, I've seen people flying them in playgrounds, car parks, a whole bunch of places. I fly this one around the house and I'm having a blast with it. And with that being said, that doesn't mean these are slow by any means. So if you guys Google some 4S Rotor X Atom sort of action, I'm sure you will find it. It speeds still a lot more than I can handle anyway. And a good little note as well, because these builds are usually much, much lighter, like I know my Atom is about 100 grams compared to maybe 250 or 300 or even 400 on some of my other builds. When these things crash, the smaller the quad and the lighter it is, it has a lot less sort of potential energy or kinetic energy moving into a crash, and it's going to sort of hold up a lot better when it impacts the ground, as opposed to something that's like a big heavy rock crashing into the ground. This has a lot more force. It's going to do a lot more damage and put a lot more stress on the carbon and the frame and the components compared to one of these things. These things just seem to bounce around when they hit the ground, and some of the bigger, heavier quads can make a much sort of more solid impact. Alright Stu, so yeah, okay, you've convinced me to get whatever size prop I've got, let's say 5 example, but that's not really helping me too much because there's some other factors that I'm a bit confused about, and that might be the design of the quad. So right here, this is the Drone Wolf pup, and this will spin 5-inch props, and you notice it's got a very tight clearance here, but anyway, it doesn't matter, it can still spin a 5-inch prop, and then right next to it, this one can also spin a 5-inch, and this is an F1 pod from Armaton, and if you look at these things, they look totally different. Look at this, look at these side profiles, and I'll show you some close-ups of them as well. They are two totally different looking quads, and they're going to handle a little bit differently because of their aerodynamics and shapes and things like that. But what you really sort of need to think about is it's all about the distribution of weight. So as much as you can, you want to get all the mass closer to the center of the quadcopter, so closer to the center of gravity. And both of these frames do this quite well, and they pretty much just extend their weights differently. So this one is heavy, I guess, across this axis just here, where it's quite tight and very centered in the middle, I guess, on this axis. I can't remember what axis that is. Whereas this one is not long, so there's not very much weight around here, but it's very tall across. So it's very tall across the front of the frame. So they're both going about it in different ways. It's just up to you to think about what sort of frame you would like. And I have to say, I think that building in one of these sort of traditional style of frames where the battery goes on the top and you put your stuff sort of in the components in like a longer way is a lot easier to build than say one of these pods. But I think the pods have better both better aerodynamics, and they sort of are a bit more responsive and feel a bit more agile in the air. That's just my opinion anyway. I'm sure some people differ. And another thing to note though, on the flip side of that, these ones here, the sort of standard sort of body, these longer quads, they are much better at carrying a GoPro than some of these. These ones you can still do it, but you start putting it on the top, and pretty much all that's doing is that's making the weight go long ways, and you're almost back to square one. So you've got a long pillar up the top if you sit your GoPro or something on the top like that. So for me, for ease of build and I guess carrying a GoPro, get a frame like this. If you're more interested in racing and getting better lap times and aerodynamics, get one of these bad boys. Alright, so once you've made that choice and you've decided what sort of style of frame you want and what size it's going to run, another thing you need to consider too is how it goes together. And that would be something you can notice the difference underneath here. We have, looking at our 210 Epi and our Drone Wolf pup, this one has separate arms right here, and this one has one solid base plate. This one is probably a bit easier to put together, and something you really need to consider is how good a pilot are you? Where are you going to be flying this thing? Because if you're going to be crashing it over concrete or in car parks or something like that, you want to get the strongest frame you can. So you need to look out for things like how much protection is it going to have on the motor? Is it a single plate, which I think is a lot tougher than, say, the separate arms like you have here on the Drone Wolf pup? And also, how thick is the carbons? So you can see here they both have 4mm arms on these ones, which is pretty standard, but some other frames have 3. I know this Orion is 2.5, and you can look at the difference just here. So this one would be a lot stronger than my Orion. So you need to think how good of a pilot you are, how much you're going to be crashing it, which to be honest, we all crash. If you don't crash, you're not flying hard enough. And you need to think whereabouts you're going to be flying it. And another thing to note, while I do think that this sort of unibody is a lot better frame than something that has arms like this, it is also a pain. If you break one of these arms, you have to replace the whole bottom plate, whereas if you break one of these arms, you only have to replace that arm. So that's definitely a plus, sort of a plus and minus. You're more likely to break these ones, but they're a lot cheaper to replace. You're less likely to break this, but if you do break it, you have to sort of replace the whole bottom plate. Alrighty, so just when you think you're ready to build and you've sort of understood all that and you're ready to pick your frame, you see something like this online, and that makes your brain start ticking again, because you might see something like this. Now, this is the Tyrannosaurus Hex, and what you'll notice straight away, it looks very different, and this is a Hex style frame. Now, these are sort of fallen out of fashion a little bit, but they're still pretty cool things. But what this pretty much is, instead of having your 4 motors, you can see that it's going to have 6 motors and six props spinning around. So it is going to generate a lot more lift. It's going to have a lot more thrust behind it anyway as it's pumping through the air, but it will also have a larger surface area. Now, this is the first Hex frame that I've ever had, and there's some good things going for them, but you also need to watch out for some things. I don't recommend these for first-time builders because, one, they're going to be more expensive, so you're going to have to, instead of buying 4 motors, you're going to have to be buying 6 and 6 ESCs and things like that. 2, because you've got those 2 extra motors and 2 ESCs and 2 extra arms, you have a significant amount of weight because some of the motors are very heavy on some of these bad boys. You have a significant amount of weight in your quad, so it might reduce your flight times. It's going to be sucking down the battery, and on top of that, if you crash this thing, there's a lot more energy going into the force of the impact because you've got all that extra weight behind it. So I think they're probably more prone to breaking than their sort of quad brothers. And one thing to consider, because it is a Hex, you're going to have a bit larger surface area sort of pushing through the air, so you're going to be moving a lot more air, and you might find hitting those gaps a little bit more difficult if you're flying around in a Hex. But in saying that, you've got a ton of thrust behind you, so this thing should be an absolute screamer. Alrighty, so we've got our frames, and you would have noticed all the frames I've talked about so far are made out of carbon fiber, and this is just a very simple tip. This one's very easy to understand because you get a bunch of other frames out there. They could be fiberglass, they could be sort of like a G10 plastic or something like that. Anything that is not carbon fiber, in my opinion, is garbage, because if it's steel, it's going to be strong, but it's going to be heavy, and so carbon fiber is sort of the best of all the worlds. This is why everybody uses it. It is strong and it is super light, so you keep the weight down, and it is also super rigid. So if you're going to use G10 plastics or any of those other ones, I really strongly recommend just spend the extra few dollars and get a carbon frame. Definitely worth it. So there it is, there's my guide to choosing the correct mini quad frame for you. So hopefully that helps a lot of you guys out there, because I know I do get this question a lot, and they should be better informed to make a sort of decision on what's going to work and what you want. Subscribe for more FPV related content. I'm going to leave a bit of a montage at this end of the video with some of the frames I have. And if you have any frames you think I should definitely be checking out, stick them in the comments below. Subscribe for more FPV related content, and as always, happy flying! Rightio, so this is my 250 ZMR right here when it was new. This is Armaton's pod, the F1 pod. Coming up next, this is the Emax Nighthawk, covered in LEDs around the outside for fun. Flex RC, this one's the Owl from Flex RC. This is the F1 4B from Armaton. And coming up next, I never got around to reviewing this one yet. This is the Epi H from Epiquads. This one's in pieces, but that's the Air X from Earth, Air, Fire, Water. The Epi X210, and then I think we've got the Speed Addict, the 180 Speed Addict R from Catalyst Machine Works, the 180 Epi Quad, so I love that one there, the Rotorex's Atom, fantastic little quad, that one's so much fun. We've got a Drone Wolf Pup, so go Aussies, that's the Drone Wolf Pup, spins 5-inch, and finally we've got the Orion 155X. And then right at the end here, can't wait to build this one, this is the Tyrannosaurus Hex.